Are there any questions about anything up till now? Evidently not, because everybody had good test scores. Even Flight School 21 had good test scores. Hopefully, if I left any questions unanswered about power steering brakes and swivel locks, over the next couple of days we can answer those. Today we're going to get into utility hydraulics. We're going to take our time with utility hydraulics because flight control hydraulics, a lot of the components are the same. So if we take our time today, then when we go through utility or flight control hydraulics, we should be able to walk through that depending on how much everybody remembers. Let's see. I've got a busy slide up here. I'm going to show it. It'll be shown probably 3 times during this class. First time I'm going to talk about some of the things that are on here in some of the classes. The second time I show you, we'll talk about a few things. And the third time it showed, I may ask you how the system works. I could play with a drop of hydraulic fluid, but you're in an advanced class here, so we won't do that. Some of the things I want you to remember. If we'll look at the slide, we'll see several different pressures on there. I need you to understand that you only really need to remember 2 of them. Our brakes operate off of what pressure? 1390. Our engine starters operate off of 3350. All the other subcomponents inside the utility hydraulic system, if I ask you what they operate off of, they should be operating off of 3000 psi. We're going to talk about temperature bulbs today. When you get into the transmission classes, you'll talk about temperature probes / switches. A bulb and a probe basically do the same thing. Does anybody know what a bulb or a temperature bulb or a probe does? It takes a temperature or fluid reading, turns it into an electrical signal, and sends it to a gauge. And a switch, what does a switch do for us? We'll talk about a switch today. Switch turns something off, switch turns something on. 97% of the time in a Chinook it turns on a light or turns off a light. Bulbs, probes, transducers, and transmitters. When somebody asks you a question and they get to these points, when they ask you if it's a temperature bulb or a probe, if you'll just answer temperature bulb / probe, you can't be wrong. Transmitters are going to be the same thing. Transmitters, transducers, they both do the same thing. They take a fluid pressure reading, turn it into an electrical signal, and send it to a gauge. Today we'll be talking about transmitters. A transducer is the same thing, but you'll notice when you go through our engine class, the transducer that is on there, they're vented to the atmosphere. Allow a little bit of the pressure to bleed off of that. But transmitters, transducers, bulbs, probes, and switches. All right, today, describe the components, operational characteristics, functions, emergency procedures, and limitations of the 47 utility hydraulic system. In our classroom, given your student handout, and again, this next test is going to be hydraulic heavy. Between utility hydraulics, flight control hydraulics, and landing gear, you're going to have a lot of questions. There'll be 10 questions. You've got to get 7 of those correct to get a go in this block of instructions. Safety requirements really are none, but we have a lot of training aids today. Be careful when we pass them around. Risk assessment's low, environmental considerations are none. And again, the second exam, 90 minutes, you got to get a go on this portion. Describe the utility hydraulic system. On page 4, we've listed under alpha, we've listed some of the components. There are 9 subsystems that we're going to talk about. When you look at your -10, it will probably list out 11 of them, or maybe even 13. But where in our system, we talk about the engine start system. There's 1 engine and number 2 engine. We count them as 1. PTUs, there's number 1 PTU and number 2 PTU. We count those as 1. So if you answer on the flight line, you answer 9 subsystems and your IP doesn't quite agree with you, that's where he got it from, is out of the -10. We'll go through like we have most of our classes. try to identify the components, show you where they're at, then we'll come back through and we'll talk about them and how they operate. Pressure control module. 8 and 9 drive shaft facing towards the back of the aircraft. If I stand underneath the 8 and 9 drive shaft and look up and to my right will be the pressure control module. On top of the pressure control module are 5 solenoid valves. Those 5 solenoid valves allow us to control the flow of fluid in the utility hydraulic system. So we can isolate leaks, we can start our engines with those, and you can definitely be guaranteed when you pre-flight you can see those 5 solenoid valves, and you will be asked about those and how they operate. We will cover all 5 of those. The return control module, again, standing under the 8 and 9 drive shaft, look up to your left. Got the return control module. All fluid, after it passes through all its components and does its job before it returns back to our utility hydraulic reservoir, must go through the return control module. It's a collection point, be filtered before it goes back into the system. Also on top of the return control module we'll talk about today is the transfer cylinder. There are 3 little red buttons. There's one on the bottom of the filter, there's one about halfway up, and then there's one on the side that we can't see in this picture. You will be asked about these on the flight line. What are these 3 buttons and what makes them pop? We'll cover that. Our reservoir cooler assembly, standing on top of the aircraft next to the number 2 engine, facing the aft pylon. They should, during pre-flight, pull this little panel up. It's probably about 24 inches by 18 inches tall. Look inside that panel, immediately to your right-hand side, you should see our reservoir. It's where our fluid is stored and cooled prior to it needing to be used. Utility hydraulic pump, located on what side of the aft transmission? Say it with belief. By now we should have this beat up because it was on the exam the other day. I asked you where the flight control pump was. This is the utility hydraulic pump. It's located on the number 2 side of the aft transmission, on the right side. 3,000 psi, constant pressure, 0 to 16.5 gallons variable delivery. I have a pump today broken down so that we can show you how that variable delivery takes place. Auxiliary power unit, located on front of the auxiliary power unit motor / pump, located on front of the APU. Produces 3350 psi for engine start. It's also a backup pump for utility system during in-flight emergencies. And then our Apu Start Accumulator, located on the right-hand side of the aft transmission, underneath the little panels that fold down. Apu Start Accumulator stores 3,000 psi for Apu start and some in-flight emergencies. Apu Start module. Located at station 570 on the right-hand side of the aircraft in the back. This governs our Apu start. On front of the APU, I talked about it had that motor / pump. This is what helps tell that when to be a motor and when to be a pump, because it cannot start the APU and try to pump hydraulic fluid at the same time. So this is what tells it when to be a motor and when to be a pump. Brake accumulator, we talked about that the other day, located in the forward pylon area. When we pre-flight that, what should the pre-charge be reading? 600 to 1400 psi. The higher the number, the more brake pumps you're going to have in an emergency. Okay, now I'm going to beat this one up today. And the only word missing off my slide here is utility. Utility reservoir pressurization accumulator. When we talk about this accumulator, if you can remember the proper name of this accumulator, it's telling you exactly what it does. Inside our reservoir, where it's sitting at the top, we need 55 to 60 psi of head pressure on the back side of that fluid, so that when we get ready to use that fluid, we're drawing fluid and not air. If we draw air in a pump, what are we going to do to it? Cavitate it. So this utility reservoir pressurization accumulator keeps that 55 to 60 psi of head pressure on the back side of it when the system is not online. So when I reach up there and turn the APU on and get my utility motor pump pumping, it's going to suck fluid, not air. Power steering module. We talked about it a little bit Friday. I've got one in here now to show you during this class. Power transfer units. This is about all we're going to talk about these today. We'll talk about these a lot during the flight control hydraulics class. 90% of this pump unit itself is probably utility. We use utility pressure on one side of it, on the left-hand side, to turn a pump on the right-hand side to give us our flight controls pressure whenever we do our flight control travel hydraulics check prior to engine start. And if in flight emergencies, if you lose one of your flight boost pumps, these can be used in that. So with it being a little bit of both, we decided to talk about it during flight control hydraulics class. And then our overhead control panel. We'll talk about all these switches today except for the one in the upper right-hand corner, flight control switch. We'll talk about that one Thursday. Our hand pump. We'll talk about how it works, whether we're moving air when we pump it or whether we're using moving hydraulic fluid. And then our maintenance panel in the back. If it has anything to do with hydraulic fluid and it's a gauge, it's on this panel in the back. In the predecessor models, these gauges were all up front. We took them out and put them to the flight engineers in the back. We'll talk about everything on the right-hand side today, utility system. And then we're going to talk about some of the lights on the bottom, what makes those illuminate and what we must do whenever they do come on.
Is there a reason the pilot doesn't have these indications anymore? I mean, what was their logic for putting it in the back rather than having it up in the cockpit?
It doesn't make it any less important by moving it in the back. Over the years, we have developed with the flight engineer course that we've got going. We're more of a crew now. These are important things, so we've involved the crew chiefs in the back. You've got your master caution light on the master caution panel. If you lose pressure, it comes on. You just ask the chief, what's our pressure riding at. But you have a lot going on up front. They felt this was something they could move in the back and let the flight engineers take care of.
Okay.
There are 4 sources of hydraulic pressure for the utility system. Our Apu Start Accumulator. How many PSI did I say we store there? 3,000 PSI. APU motor / pump. How much pressure? 3,350. Our utility pump, located on the right side of the aft transmission, 3,000 PSI. And then again, my favorite one is the Apu. The Apu can supply us with the pressure needed for our utility hydraulic system, number 1 flight control system, number 2 flight control system. It can supply us power for DC or AC. Again, if this is hooked up to our aircraft, just turn around and go home because you're not flying. Somebody's working on it. Utility system provides hydraulic pressure to operate how many subsystems? 9. Which pressure source will provide the 3,350 PSI? APU motor / pump. What maintains 60 PSI return pressure on the utility reservoir? I said that whenever you could remember its name, that's what it does. The Utility Reservoir Pressurization Accumulator, also known as ERPA. Somebody's give us a little short thing called ERPA, or bootstrap accumulator. But if you can remember the proper name, it tells you what it does. What stores fluid under pressure for APU starting? APU Start Accumulator. All right, learning step activity number 2. We'll get down and start talking about these components. The utility reservoir / cooler. Here is our reservoir cooler. You'll notice that when all our coolers are mounted, they're mounted canted just like this. The purpose of that cant is to keep the air at the top, and we'll talk about why. But the utility reservoir cooler will store 2.17 gallons of fluid in the reservoir itself. The cooler section this is the utility cooler. It's seen a little bit better days. This is the flight control. Again, this is one of the reasons I say if we take our time today, the flight control should move a little bit faster. It's just like a radiator in a car, truck, or any of our automobiles. It's got little tubes going through here. As we draw air in through a fan, it cools the fluid down as it goes through there. There is no thermostat associated with this, so it should be cooling it at all times.
Can I interrupt you for a second? It's on page 16, guys, if you're looking for it in your handout.
Yeah. Again, hopefully by now we know where it's located at. It does not have thermostat capabilities. It does not work like that part of the function of our cars, but it does have bypass capability, and we will talk about that when we talk about the bypass valve. And now we are going to talk about the bypass valve. Bypass valve located on the reservoir itself. And once the cooler becomes clogged, about 20 psi of back pressure on it, this will start opening and be fully open at 100 psi. I don't really haven't heard from any of their students from the FEI course or the IP course of a big problem with them getting blocked up. If they get nicked and dinged and damaged like this one is, yeah, it may start causing a backup. But viscosity will cause them to bypass until the fluid gets warmed up. So if you're in a place like Alaska and it gets cold, it may bypass. It will go from, instead of going into the cooler, it will just dump directly into the reservoir. Theory behind that is the fluid that had already passed through should be cooled off a little bit. Taking that hydraulic fluid, cooling it off some. It's better to have hot hydraulic fluid than no hydraulic fluid. But there's the bypass valve. The reservoir itself, again, I said it held 2.17 gallons of hydraulic fluid. And then on the back side of it, next to that bypass valve, was a temperature bulb. What did I say earlier that a temperature bulb is going to do for us? Temperature bulb is going to take a reading of the hydraulic fluid before it goes into the reservoir. It's going to read it. And it's going to turn it into an electrical signal, and it's going to send it to our maintenance panel in the back. What are our ranges for our temperature utility system or flight control system? Caution range. 95 to 120, never to exceed 120. Keep that in mind. Bleed relief valve. It's only human nature that when I show you that something moves, and when you get out on the aircraft, you want to see it move. Bleed relief valve is located on top of the reservoir. Like I said, whenever it was canted, sitting up there at the top, that's the air at the top. This bleed relief valve serves a couple of purposes. I can manually bleed air out of the system if I know there's air in it. Or it will automatically vent some of the air out, and it prevents overpressurization. After a while, when we talk about our return control module, we'll talk about the filter will bypass. If it gets in a bypass mode, something gets clogged up, instead of the pressure building up on the backside and causing this reservoir to get really highly pressurized and exploding, this bleed relief valve will let that go through. Now I want to caution you about this. I've told you that it moves, and we have a tendency to, again, to go out there and move things. Well, this tube right there is where the hydraulic fluid is going to come out when I touch that bleed relief valve. That tube used to be clear. Anybody got an idea where it's going to drain down whenever I let that fluid come out of that?
Right-hand side of the
Exterior.
In the back, in the ramp area, you'll notice on the right-hand side, well, both sides of the aircraft, there are some drain vent valves, fluid vent valves. You're going to be up top pre-flighting. Your stick buddy may be already on the outside, back there by the right aft landing gear, bent down pre-flighting. You reach up there, you touch that bleed relief valve, hydraulic fluid starts coming out, your stick buddy's going to get wet. Going to get wet with hydraulic fluid. Now you've missed the mission because their flight suit's no good. So be aware when you grab these things and you touch them. If you want to move one, you can move the one that's here in the classroom, because there's really not going to do anything for you on the flight line. And we've talked about these before. Lvdt. Now I can show you one. We've cut this out. There is the rod inside here, linear variable differential transducer. Further in this goes, the more resistance on that Lvdt. Further out it sells, less resistance. Turns it into an electrical signal through a cannon plug, sends it to the gauge in the cockpit, telling me my fluid level of my reservoir. This is what we should be looking for when we physically go up top and pre-flight it. The little green band, visual level indicator. That tells us how much fluid's in there. Now I've told you that we've given you an Lvdt that gives us our reading on the gauge. Why do I have two different places to read the fluid level? Where's this at? Up top. Can I see this during flight? No. So this gives a flight engineer an indication of the Lvdt. The reading that's taken on the Lvdt gives him a visual indication on the gauge and on the maintenance panel of what the fluid level is. Because you'll notice when we start talking later about emergency procedures, you're going to start talking about is fluid loss evident. Well, if I can't see the fluid leaking on the side of the aircraft, I can go back there to my maintenance panel, to the fluid level indicator, and if it's leaking, it will show up on the fluid level. Because I told you earlier that the pumps, 3,000 PSI constant pressure, how much variable delivery? Or how much can it pump per minute? 16 gallons per minute. So if I spring a leak and it's pretty big, it's not going to take it very long. I'll be able to notice that that fluid level is going away. There again is how our Lvdt works or looks. Now then I'm going to talk about a temperature switch. We've talked about our bulb, we've talked about our bypass. Temperature switch. I said a switch turns something off and a switch turns something on. What do we think this switch turns off and on?
95 degrees.
Okay, that's the temperature. Most of the time people will tell me it turns on a light. This is the thing that falls in the 3% area. This will turn on a cooling fan. When the utility hydraulic fluid gets hot, it will turn on the cooling fan located in the aft pylon. There is the cooling fan. Cooling fan requires both AC and DC for operations. It's DC controlled, AC operated. When we start talking a little bit later on about electrical, you'll understand why you're going to land in, when you do not have a bus tie, why you're going to land. You're not going to have a cooler fan working. Hydraulic fluid, when it gets hot and it vaporizes, is more volatile than our fuel. So this is one of the reasons that we're landing. It's in your student handout. Some of you may have read ahead of time. When does our cooling fans kick on? 63. Cuts back off at 54. The power of 9. Both add up to 9 and both divided by 9, so try to remember it with the power of 9. Okay, it kicks on at 63, cuts off at 54. You've told me that their temperature gauges are right, caution is 95 to 120, 120 max. We're flying along, we're fat, dumb, and happy. Could you do a 30-minute ramp check? Chief comes over the intercom, says, sir, ma'am, utility hydraulic temperature gauge is reading 85 degrees. Your response is?
That's good.
Okay, I hear a that's good. I hear a lot of no responses. This is why this is back during introduction. I talked about you're going to get a lot of systems thrown at you now, and you're going to start wondering why we're asking you these questions. Get a little bit of understanding about the system. Is there anything wrong? It's 85 degrees.
But wouldn't you want them to monitor it to make sure that the cooling fans are being overwhelmed?
Okay. I would want them to monitor it. I would say, Chief, keep an eye on it because there is something wrong. It should have kicked on at 63. At 63, it might ride up to about 66, 67, then it's going to start cooling on until it goes back down to 54 degrees. I cannot hear the cooling fan with all the noise going on in the back. The cooling fan is way up top. The reason that we point this out is happening in the desert. Those cooling fans, where they sit, they've just got a wire mesh on the top of them. They're cone-shaped on the inside. Sand, dust is getting inside there and it's slowing the fans down and in some cases making them stop. And they're not popping circuit breakers. So if the chief does come over the intercom and tell you that it's starting to ride at 70 degrees, you've got a problem. You haven't got there yet, it hasn't given you your limits yet, but you do have a problem. Just remember the 63 and 54.
So anything above 63, you're looking for like a line as soon as practical type situation?
You really haven't hit anything in your dash 10 that tells you to land as soon as practical. It's just one of these things that you should start being aware of and being cautious. Finish up your mission maybe and go back and check it out. Don't just leave it and let it happen to somebody else when it goes out. Again, it's hard to tell you that, yeah, do something when a dash 10 tells you you still haven't reached the limit. But it's just system awareness that something is about to go wrong. The FEs and the IPs that I've talked to that have come back from the desert, even on a hot day, has never really gotten above 70 degrees. Even without these fans, you've got the rotor systems turning, pushing a lot of air. The utility reservoir pressurization accumulator. On page 21 of your student handout. ERPA, what I would like to call it. Located in the aft pylon area in the maintenance panel, this should be reading our system pressure. We've got a lot of accumulators. When I talk system pressure, that's the pressure that we've pumped into the system plus our pre-charge. Again, this one should be reading 3,000 PSI. Its purpose in life is, without the system online, is to keep that 55 to 60 PSI back pressure on this reservoir. Once the system gets online, then it's there to dampen out surges. And if the pump can't keep up for some reason, the utility system, that's not really a problem. I'll show you how in the flight control system that accumulators really work hard. But it's there in case the pumps, if I'm operating my winch, my cargo hook, and my ramp at the same time and the pump can't keep up, a little bit of stored pressure that's inside the accumulator will be there to take up for that. There again is the accumulator. This is where it gets its nickname, the bootstrap, from the way that it's fastened inside there with a little straps that's on there. I guess many years ago, boots used to strap over that way, And they just developed that nickname. You would be right in both cases. Our hand pump, page 22 of your student handout. Our hand pump is used to get that 3,000 psi into our accumulator. Whenever we're pumping this is a dual action pump. Whenever I pull down on it, I'm pumping hydraulic fluid. Whenever I push up on it, I'm pumping hydraulic fluid. You'll see those out there that will think that this is how they get their PT. They'll dump the pressure just to pump it back up. It's not that easy. So if it does accidentally get dumped out, or you're trying to troubleshoot the APU and your crew chief has pumped it up once or twice, you may get back there and help him. But every time, for every stroke, come down, go back up, we're pumping hydraulic fluid inside our APU Start Accumulator and compressing the air, the pre-charge inside there. Okay. For the last 30 minutes, we've been talking about the utility system. Have I left everybody totally lost? And the handout, again, I apologize for the handout. It's not really following my slide presentation, but we're going to make it work the best we can. All right, when I pump the hand pump, what am I moving? Air or fluid? Fluid. I'm compressing it inside my utility Start Accumulator. When we talk about the utility Start Accumulator, we'll talk about exactly what's going on the inside. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is the emergency utility valve. And so that we stay online, that is again on page 22G. You can see where it is in relation to the hand pump on this slide, and there it is. There will be a time that you, as a pilot, will have to use this valve. This valve allows us to use the stored fluid inside the APU Start Accumulator to operate some of our subsystems. You as a pilot, about the only time I can really think, and you will probably have to do it, is while pre-flighting in the ramp area. APU's not online, don't have an Apu hooked up to it. You're pre-flighting, the ramp may be down, it's not level, or it may be level and you see something up a little bit higher that you need to get to take a closer look at. In order to use that stored hydraulic fluid to raise the ramp, all you would need to do is grab this valve, pull it towards you, grab the ramp control valve, put it in the up position, get it to where you want it to go, put it to stop, and close this valve. And then pump the pump. You use some of the pressure, pump some back in. But that's how you would raise the ramp without the APU being online. And this is how we use that fluid that's stored in there. All right, on page 22 again of your student handout, I'm going to show you another valve. It looks a lot like this valve, but I'm showing you this other valve so you'll leave it alone. Again, on page 22, the utility reservoir depressurization valve. This one is used by maintenance. If I have to service the utility reservoir pressurization accumulator, if I notice the pre-charge low than it, if I have to service it, this is how I dump some of the pressure out of that. I show you this valve because it looks like the other valve, and we don't want you touching this valve. The valve that I told you could touch, the utility emergency pressure valve, should be about waist high on most everybody. I know we got tall people and we got short people, but it should be waist high. If it's waist high, you can grab it. If I have to reach up for it like I will this valve, leave it alone. This one will be for maintenance functions. And my utility hydraulic system pump. Or not, yeah, my pump. That's going to be on page 20 of your student handout. How much pressure did I say that this pump delivers? 3,000 psi all the time. When you go out there and you pre-flight this pump, you'll notice that there are 4 lines going into it. Pressure line, it's not really a return line, but it's a suction line. It's got a sump drain on it, and then we've got on the top that you can't see will be a case drain line at the top. And that's inevitable. When you go out there, your IP will ask you sometimes when you see 2 lines going into a component, Which one's return and which one's pressure? How can I tell? I hear by the size.
Stainless steel and aluminum.
I hear stainless steel and aluminum.
Read the label, read the label.
Read the label. Okay. I was one of these flight engineers that go out there. I like to have a pretty aircraft. That label gets a little bit of hydraulic fluid on it. Off goes the label. I get rid of that. Size, well, on this one there's two different sizes, and they're both pressure. 99.9% of the time, if I really want to know if it's return or pressure, is the stainless steel versus aluminum. I'm not going to give you 100% because that's a wrong kind of guarantee. Somebody may slip something in on me. But 99% of the time, if it's got stainless steel fittings on it, this is going to be pressure. And then the other aluminum fittings, whether they're blue, they're gray, they're green, they're red, as long as it's aluminum, it will be on the return side. Other ways work, most of the time the size, most of the time the little labels, but not 100%, 99.9% of the time the stainless steel. All right, I said that it give us 3,000 PSI all the time. Once we get the aircraft cranked and we get in the air, there's not really anything in the utility system that we're operating. The ramp's up, swivel switch is probably locked, the winch is off. If you pick up a cargo, if you kick up an external load, once you get up to a safe altitude, you disarm the hook. Not really anything we're operating. So this pump still is giving me 3,000 PSI, but it has to slow the flow rate down. That is accomplished. There's a wobble plate. This little thing that's sideways is called a wobble plate on the inside. Once we stop using some of the systems in there, pressure will start building up on the back side of it. That 3,000 PSI will come in and will push down on the wobble plate, bringing this side up. When this pump operates and these pistons go around, when they come down on this low side, they're drawing in hydraulic fluid. When they come back up on the high side, they're pushing out hydraulic fluid. So by not using any pressure or not by using any hydraulic fluid in that 3,000 PSI back pressure building up here, if it comes around and it's not sucking in any hydraulic fluid, then there's no hydraulic fluid for it to push out. Simple? Understand how that's operating? Okay, showed you how that works. All right, well, these pistons going in and out of here all the time, something's got to wear out. And the older pumps, we'll pass this around in a moment, let everybody see it. This portion right here, the brass portion, used to be made out of stainless steel. Our pistons were made out of stainless steel. They would get to a point that'd start wearing and then something would have to give. All of a sudden, poof, there went a pump. Engineers, being the smart ones that they are, decided to make this casing right here out of brass. This will be the weak link in the system. So as these pump pistons go in and out and start wearing it out, if there's any bleed over back pressure from here, it will go through our case, what we call the case drain. Can't see on this slide, and it will go back to my return control module. Once an excessive amount of hydraulic fluid is allowed to leak through there and goes to my return control module, it will trip one of those 3 filter buttons, or 3 little red buttons called pump fault button. It will tell me that I've exceeded a flow rate of a gallon per minute on the back side of these pistons, and my pump is beginning to fail. It may fail in 5 minutes, it may fail in 5 years, but now they've given us an indication of how that goes. Again, the waffle plate, I'm going to pass this around. You can turn this and see how the pistons go in and out, which way it would suck in hydraulic fluid and push out hydraulic fluid. When you pass it from person to person, don't grab the top. I'll laugh at you. The rest of the class will laugh at you. But if you want to take it apart to see how the pistons look, take it apart, turn it upside down to put it back together. But be careful with it as you pass it around. I'll pass around the case. On the inside, you can see the slots. The larger side is where it's sucking in the hydraulic fluid. The smaller side will be where it's pushing the hydraulic fluid pressure out.
Did it right away?
Did it right away. Let me see this real quick. There's always got to be one of us. But there are the pistons that are on the inside. And as the case turns, well, as this turns, the pistons will go in and out. Hey, we all were curious. Everybody else would have been afraid to ask. I've had to do it once or twice. But if you want to take it apart, everybody knows how to take it apart and put it back together now. So you understand how the wobble plate and how the demand makes it work on there now. 3,000 PSI starts pushing, and when you get that wobble plate, try to push down on it. You'll see how much pressure 3,000 PSI really is. When we talk about the APU motor pump after a while, the insides of it are going to be pretty much the same as that one. All right, my meat and potatoes. This probably will be back up to the front of your student handout. Back to page 8. Pressure control module. It's not to be confused with the power control module later on. This in the utility system is the pressure control module. It receives pressure from our Apu Start Accumulator, our Apu motor pump, and our utility hydraulic pump. All three of those pressures, whichever pump may be pumping, will go into the one side of it there. The Apu has a different connection that comes into the side where it receives the pressure and distributes it through the system. Some of the components that are on top of this. And here's one in real life. First thing we're going to talk about are the two engine start solenoids in the back. These two solenoid valves are they're normally closed, electrically open. When do we open these start solenoid valves? Whenever we hit our engine start switch, whether it's 1 or 2, it will open. All right. Either side, whichever we flip, number 1 or number 2, will allow that one to open. How much pressure am I releasing when I do that engine start? A little bit louder. Say that with confidence.
3350?
3350. There we go. Now, do I want 3,350 PSI slamming straight into the side of that engine?
Nope.
If I do send 3,350 PSI slamming into the side of that motor or that engine, it's going to blow that engine off, or the start motor off of there. So to slow that down, they've given us the engine pressure operated valves. These little cylinders on the back side of them. When I passed around that bypass valve earlier that went into the utility reservoir, it was a smaller version of these. That 3350 PSI will come into the bottom side of these, pushing the spring up. That pressure from that spring will slow the flow of hydraulic fluid down to your start motor and will keep it from spinning that motor off the side of the engine. Anytime that I've got to release hydraulic fluid to a component that has a motor on it, my engines, my winch, my power transfer units, if I've got a motor on the opposite end of it, there will be a slow to open valve to let that motor start spooling up slowly. The next components that our next solenoid valve we're going to talk about, and this will be the way you're looking at it when you're pre-flighting. You're going to be looking at it this way. It's going to be sitting up there facing towards the back of the aircraft. The first valve that I like to talk about that's broken off on mine, 4 switches will affect this. If I reach up and turn on my number 1 PTU, I will activate this solenoid valve. my number 2 PTU, my center cargo hook, or my winch. Any of those 4 switches will activate this valve. Along with that valve, next to it, is a pressure operated valve. Again, anytime I have a component that has a motor on it, I have to have this pressure operated valve. Because when I open this up, PTUs have a motor on them. My winch has a motor on it. I must slow it down with this pressure operated valve, and that's its purpose. The next one is affected by one switch, but affects 3 systems. The first one was 4. This one affects 3 systems, but it's one switch. We talked about it Friday. The brake steer switch on the overhead control panel for the hydraulics. If I turn this off, if I turn that off, I've stopped the flow of hydraulic fluid to 3 different places. Power steering, my brakes, and my swivel locks. And then last but not least, the solenoid valve that should be here on the end on the outside, one system, the ramp. So I've talked about the 2 in the back that were my engine start solenoid valves. When you're pre-flighting this, whichever engine that start solenoid valve is the closest to will be that engine. Usually this one is closest to the number 1, the number 2. This one, 4 different switches affected it. What 4 switches affected it? PTUs, winch, center cargo hook. Very good, sir. Because I can tell you, I'm the world's worst about failing to mention that it's a center cargo hook. But it must be the center cargo hook because the other 2 are electrical. Says it on there too. Good job. One switch, 3 systems. Which are those 3 systems? Power steering, brakes, swivel locks. Keeping in mind, again, dash 10 talks about isolation switch. There is no such switch marked isolation switch. If there is a leak in my swivel locks, do I necessarily need to go up to that one power steer switch and isolate it with that one? Can I isolate my swivel locks without disabling my brakes and my power steering? If I don't have that switch on the center console in the lock position, my swivel locks are not activated. So if I had it in the lock position, I would just go unlock, and then that was going to remove the hydraulic fluid going to the flow of my swivel locks. So yes, you have the switch up top. You could isolate all 3 systems. But if my power steering was leaking, I would just reach down there and go to the swivel switch locked, and my power steering would quit leaking. Try to think a little bit about what do I need to disable, what do I need to disable the whole system. When we talk Thursday about flight control hydraulics, we'll talk about when this one is affected again more often. When I turn on my first PTU, I'm activating this. What happens with the effect of that 3350 that's sitting outside the second PTU? Because when I flip that first switch, I've let that 3350 go now. It's sitting outside those other components waiting for me to open those components also. Some of the other components that are on here. Pressure transmitter. What does a transmitter do for me? Transmitters, transducers. What do? They take a pressure, fluid pressure, turn it into an electrical signal, in this case, send it where? to the maintenance panel in the back, telling us how much pressure we should have in the utility system. What should our pressures in the utility system be with a range? Say it with confidence so they can all hear you. 2,500 to 3,500. Good job. Pressure switch. Located on the back side. Pressure switch is your only indication in the cockpit that anything's going wrong with the utility system, other than your flight engineer telling you. What will this pressure switch do for me? Going to turn on the light. What light? Utility hydraulic caution light. If the pressure drops below 1,800 psi on your master caution panel, you should get a light, utility system. When it goes above 2,300 psi, the light should go out. The switch is not that smart, actually somewhere between 2,000 and 2,100 psi. When it drops below it, the light's going to come on, comes back up at the same point, it's going to go off. Those are parameters that we gave the manufacturers that the light must be on by the time it reaches 1,800 psi, must be off by the time it comes back up to 2,300 psi. And then our filter has a filter button on the bottom of it. Filter button's popped. Has anybody read far enough to tell me what I should do with the filter button popped in the utility system? We're going to push it back in. And we're not going to be here at Fort Rucker, and we're not going to call maintenance. We're at home. Home station. Push the filter button back in. We're going to fire up the APU. What do you think would cause us to move the most fluid? There we go. Motor and the engines. That's what requires the most fluid pressure, and it will get the most fluid flowing. So we reset the button, start the APU and motor engines for 30 seconds. Filter button stays in, we're good to go. Filter button pops. Every good flight engineer should have an extra filter on board. Take them 5 minutes to change it. Take us 20 minutes to get a TI out there and sign it off, and good to go. On the bottom of it, we've got a filter transmitter. When these filter buttons pop, there is an electrical cannon plug hooked up on the end of it. When these filter buttons pop, there's a little metal fork that's fitting in a void space in the button that comes down. When the button comes down, it makes metal contact, giving us an indication on our maintenance panel that a filter change light has come on. That's just getting an indication because of where these things are located. This one we could see when we're pre-flight, the ones in the flight control, or when we do a ramp cruise check. The ones in the flight control system we can't see because they're up high. Or if you're fortunate enough to be in task force, a lot of your missions are going to be at nighttime. You cannot always see a filter button pop. But we've got the light on the maintenance panel that will pop, tell you that we've got a filter change light, time to change the filter. Any questions about the pressure control module?
Yes, when you, it says that the filter does not have a bypass capability. Does that mean if that pops, you're losing or your ability to get pressure to those systems and stop?
Okay, that's a good question. On the pressure side, this filter does not have bypass capability. 3,000 psi, everyone has had the opportunity to put that pump in front of them and try to fill it. 3,000 psi is a lot of pressure. If 3,000 psi cannot push its way through this filter, it should manifest itself in other directions, because if this filter's gotten clogged, I'm either starting to lose that pump and getting metal contamination inside, which would give me a pump fault light, or I've started losing O-rings and they're starting to fill up this filter. In the case of packings and O-rings starting to go, then I should start to be developing leaks. But 3,000 psi should manifest itself in other ways, hopefully. A return control module. This one's a little bit easier to hold up. It's not quite as heavy. There's 3 little red buttons on here. We're going to be expected to identify all 3 of these buttons. I should show you an easy way to do that. And then on the top, we've got a transfer cylinder. On the return filter, same filter as in the other, all the flight controls are utility systems. Right here, it's a disposable type filter. On the bottom, there is another button. This one does have bypass capabilities. If this one did not bypass, then pressure would build up on the back side of our return lines and then really start blowing fittings and lines and make a big mess in the back. And again, if this button pops, reset it, crank the APU, motor the engines for 30 seconds. Also has a filter change switch hooked up to a filter change light. Our APU motor/pump fault button. It's this button at the top. On the APU motor pump, it has a case drain like the utility hydraulic pump has. If the flow on the back side of that pump starts to exceed 1 gallon per minute, this button will pop. In that case now, with the new -10 that's come out, you have an emergency procedure now. And we'll talk about that in a little while. On the side here, we've got the pump fault button. For the utility pump, case drain again. If the case drain exceeds 1 gallon per minute, this button will pop. Button pops, light's going to come on in the maintenance panel, and we're going to have to land as soon as practical. And then our transfer cylinder that's on top. Here's a transfer cylinder that we've cut in half. All this holds probably about another quart of hydraulic fluid. This was kind of an afterthought for storing hydraulic fluid for all the hydraulic fluid needed to operate the ramp. When you go out and lower and raise the ramp, you'll notice the 2 actuating cylinders on the side. And when we go through our cargo handling class, you'll see I've got one cut in half. They use a lot of hydraulic fluid. So that we don't completely deplete this system, they've given us another system here to give us a little bit more hydraulic fluid, and its purpose is only for ramp operations, the extra hydraulic fluid needed for ramp operations. Woo. All right, those pumps, those buttons on there. I'll show you an easier way to identify these because you're not going to be able to crawl up there and look at them very easily. If you could, on the return module itself, they're marked. APU motor pump button, utility hydraulic pump button, and then of course this is the return filter button. But you're out there pre-flighting. This would be up here like this as you look at it. Which pump is the farthest away from me as I'm standing and looking at this like this? Is my utility pump or my APU motor pump farthest away from me?
APU motor pump.
APU motor pump's the farthest away from me. In this case, it would be the farthest button away from me. APU motor pump, utility pump. That's one way to look at it. If I'm pre-flighting this, my maintenance panel is here to my left. I can take my 2 fingers. I can point them up there and then bring it down here and line it up with the maintenance panel and the pump fault buttons that are there, APU and utility, that point them just like that. Put the fingers on the button or on the lights, bring them up here and they'll line up that way. Yeah, you could flip your arm upside down and get confused, but it does line up. Again, to me, the easiest way is which pump is the farthest away. That's the button that's the farthest away. Any questions about that so far? Our hydraulic fill module. We talked about this during our introduction class. We'll talk about it again. When I go out and I pre-flight this, some of the things that I should be looking for is hydraulic fluid in the sight gauge. This one has none. You want to make sure that this is full, especially if somebody is pumping. If I'm pumping this and I let this sight glass get empty, then I'm probably pumping air into the system. You as the pilot is going to feel that more than anybody. If there's air in the system, especially in the flight controls, you've got your hand on the cyclic, the thrust, and your feet on the pedals. Air in the system will set up vibrations that you're not going to like and will put your body to sleep as you're flying along. You also need to make sure that this switch is in the off position while you're pre-flighting. I'm not going to say do not look inside here, but if you want to look in here, you can look in the one that's in the classroom, or be very cautious whenever you do look at this. You're not going to see anything in there. As long as you're seeing hydraulic fluid there, then there's hydraulic fluid in there. There's a screen right there. The reason that I say be cautious with this is I've seen more than one finger popped with it. People don't pay attention. When that thing starts to close, it closes. So just make sure that that's secure, hydraulic fluid's there, and that's in the off position, and that's all we should be looking for. But when can I service the hydraulic systems? Anytime. I can service them in flight if we develop a leak, or I can service them on the ground before we start out. Any questions about that? Maintenance panel. Let's take about another 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and finish up the maintenance panel. Okay. Before I continue on, again, I know this is a little bit out of whack. Were there any questions about what we're doing so far? We're learning how to be the best we can be, I guess. How many buttons on the return control module? What are they? APU motor flash pump, fault button, utility pump fault button, and my return filter button. All right. As we continue on with our progress, what we're going to talk about now is the maintenance panel, what some of the indications are, and where do they get them from. Utility hydraulic pressure should be what range? 3,500 PSI normal operating range. Whoops, didn't want that to come up there yet. This is the temperature gauge. Where does it get its signal from? Temperature bulb, located on the reservoir, backside of the reservoir. Temperature 95 to 120, 120 being max. Keep in mind, again, if we have an electrical failure and we do not have a bus tie, we've got 3 cooler fans up top that are operating for my hydraulic systems. One's utility, the other 2 are flight boost. This is one of the reasons that when we do not have that bus tie, we are landing. Hydraulic fluid, when it gets hot and it gets in, starts leaking and it gets in a vapor state, is very volatile. We've lost an aircraft here because of that, or actually one that we were going to pick up from Fort Carson. It sprung a leak in the back, a generator sparked the fluid, and they had to land very quickly because of a big fire in the back in Arkansas. Lost the aircraft. If you read anything about our prior accidents, the one in Chico, Texas, lost the whole aircraft and all the crew on that one. Hydraulic leak, vapors, and a spark. They don't mix. So it starts to get hot. Don't play games with your hydraulic fluid. The next one's our fluid level. Fluid level came from that big long word. Lvdt, linear variable differential transducer, located inside the reservoir itself. A little green band, visual level indicator, that's how much hydraulic fluid should be in there. When I take this reading, I apologize for standing in front of the screen, but my maintenance panel trainer is not here with me. What we have to do, as long as the battery's plugged in, as I push this button, push it in, this gauge is going to come up. There are 2 circles inside there. One will tell you full with the ramp up, full with the ramp down, and the reality is 90% of the time we're going to check it when the ramp's level. You will start learning where this gauge should be at with the ramp level. I point this out to you because you need to check the levels, especially if you're going to be the one going up top to pre-flight. It's not a bad idea to walk by the maintenance panel on your way out, hit the fluid level check button, find out where your fluid level is for your utility system, for your number 1 and number 2 flight boost system, and go up top and visually make sure that they match. Again, 2.17 gallons of fluid inside this. If I'm a little bit low and I spring a leak, I want all the fluid that I can get. So that if I says full there, then when I go up top and pre-flight, this green band should be telling me that it's full. If it says full there and I go in and this is way in like that, then I know one of them is off somewhere. Get the flight engineer to get it fixed and make sure they match. Filter change lights. What will make those lights illuminate? Filter button will pop, activating that little, making contact with the metal fork on our filter change indicator switch buttons on our filters, and it will make these lights come on. The next lights are pump fault lights. What will make the pump fault lights come on?
Bleeds more than 1 gallon?
The case drain picks up the fact that there's an excessive flow in the case drain of 1 gallon per minute. Good shot, sir. 1 gallon per minute, then this light will come on. We have to evaluate the situation, land as soon as practical. It's telling you that that pump could go out in 5 minutes or it could go out in 5 years. I've had the pump fault light come on a couple of times and nothing ever happened. I've taught the people that as soon as the pump fault light came on, seconds later the pump went out. Apu Start Accumulator, located in the back of the aircraft. By now you should know where it's at. It's broken down into 4 sections. Section number 1 has has our pre-charge in it. That should be our air or nitrogen. If I want to find out what the pre-charge should be on this, where should I go look?
Isn't there a gauge right behind it, kind of?
Okay, there's the gauge, but I need to know what that pre-charge should be reading on that gauge. If I want to know when I go out to pre-flight the aircraft, how do I tell where all my accumulators of pre-charge should be at?
Associated with a gauge or a chart.
Associated with a chart. Where's that chart at? Back of the checklist, and then back of the -10. You'll look, you will find that there, for this Apu Start Accumulator, it has a separate chart for its pre-charge. The other pre-charges all fall into the same chart. On an average day, this one should have a pre-charge of 1800 psi. Section number 2 should be hydraulic fluid. Section number 3 should be hydraulic fluid. Section number 4 is vented to the atmosphere. If you will look at on my slide, the I-beam that is located there, that is a solid piece. So if we didn't vent out to the atmosphere, that piston wouldn't be able to slide up and down. I start with my hand pump. I start pumping it up. When I bring in hydraulic fluid, I'm bringing it in from section number 3, rerouting it back into section number 2. Bringing this I-beam down, compressing my air. As I compress the air, my gauge should start reading higher. I've got it up to 3,000 psi because that's what I need to start my APU. I reach up on my overhead control panel. I go to APU start, 3 to 5 seconds, and then go to run, hold it there for a couple seconds and let go. What happens is out of section number 2, that's the pressurized section of hydraulic fluid. It goes and starts turning the APU motor pump. At that time, we want it to be a motor because we want it to motor the APU. Once the APU reaches 90% speed, it considers itself self-sustaining at 90%. The first thing that an APU does is turn that from a motor to a pump, and then now it recharges this accumulator so that if something happens after that point, I don't have to go back there and hand pump it. The fluid, as it goes through out of section number 2 through the APU motor pump, comes back into section number 3. When it first recharges, it takes all the fluid back out of section number 3 back into section number 2 as it repressurizes this section. That's why we call it a self-displacing type accumulator. It goes out as we're starting the APU, back into section number 3. Once the APU reaches what speed? 90%. Then this fluid will come back in on this side and recharge, pushing down on the pre-charge, sending my gauge back to 3,000 psi. Simple?
It will always be the same fluid. It goes from section number 3 to section number 2.
It mixes a little bit into the system because it's not an isolated, I would have to fill that section up. It mixes a little bit with the return system as we play along, but as we start the APU, it's trying to use that same fluid. Okay. Some of the problems with troubleshooting the accumulator. When I go out there and I notice that my gauge is not at 3,000 PSI, first thing I'm going to try to do is hit my hand pump and pump it up to 3,000 PSI. If I start hearing an air noise going shh, 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 as I pump, something's happened. We've probably bottomed out. And if I haven't reached 3,000 PSI on my gauge, inside the accumulator itself is a ridge. It's only going to allow this I-beam to come down so far. Once it reaches there, it's saying, okay, Mr. Mechanic or Mr. Pilot, when I've reached this far, you have enough hydraulic fluid in the system, you should have 3,000 PSI on your gauge. If I don't have 3,000 PSI once I reach that, what do you think's happened?
You don't have a high enough pre-charge.
Everybody agree with him? He's right. My pre-charge is probably not there. So what am I going to have to do at that time? Unfortunately, I'm going to have to go up there to my emergency utility relief valve or emergency utility pressure valve, pull it open, and that valve that I told you, gentlemen, not to grab, I've got to pull that open, dump all the pressure that I had in my Apu Start Accumulator and see where my pre-charge is. And I'll almost guarantee you most of the time that if I hit that bottom end pressure with that noise, that my pre-charge is gone. It's not going to let you put any more hydraulic fluid in there. So be aware of it. If you're out there and the crew's back there and he's pumping, and you hear him go shh, and then he pushes that handle down, puts it up, and say, okay, we're good to go, sir. You might want to make sure that reached 3,000, and he's not kind of trying to cover it up. APU will actually crank on a less pre-charge than 3,000. It should crank at 26, but that's not to say let's do it that way. It puts undue wear and tear on the components. Any questions about the accumulator? There's the gauge. And if you spend any time pre-flight or in the Chinook world, you're going to bump your head finding this gauge. There are the little hinges for the covers that cover the aft transmission. On the number 2 engine side, back up against the airframe itself, this gauge is hidden. So you're going to have to look up and around to find that gauge. You're going to bump your head. But you should have by now this gauge, my utility reservoir pressurization accumulator gauge, my gauge that's on my power steering actuator, the accumulator, my power steering module, the accumulator that's on the bottom of that, and then a component that we're going to talk about here in a moment, APU Start module. Those 4 gauges should all be reading 3,000 PSI when you pre-flight. Those are system pressures. APU motor pump, located on front of the APU. One of the biggest differences between this and the pump that we passed around earlier is this one is going to have an additional line going into the side of it. That line is where it receives pressure from my APU Start module that I will show you in a moment. That pressure, that 3,000 PSI coming in that line, when I go to my APU Start, is what keeps that telling it to be a motor at this time. It pushes down on that wobble plate so that it can't suck any hydraulic fluid and allows the APU to turn freely. Once the APU reaches that 90% speed, the pressure that was coming through that line will go away, the wobble plate will open, and now then the APU motor / pump is now a pump. It's pumping because the APU can do it. But here is what controls that signal pressure going to that. Got a gauge on it, accumulator pressure gauge. And I probably shouldn't be doing this while it's being filmed, but I'm going to tell you now, if you don't want to fly, go find this component. It was aggravating when the D model first came out. go out on the flight line, got IPs, got passed over for promotion, or they had an argument at home and they just didn't feel like flying. You go out there, you find this gauge, it don't work. I could put a new gauge in there, fly probably 4 to 6 hours, and that gauge is broke. I will tell you how to tell if that gauge is operational so that you can continue to do your mission. But that's one of the things you look for, is this one should have 3,000 PSI. Apu Start Module Accumulator. Again, to dampen out surges and to keep in, as that APU starts, that wobble plate may go back and forth a little bit. This is to help keep that wobble plate down so that the APU motor pump is a motor while it starts. APU Start Module Depressurization Valve. Human nature, if it says push, we push. I put it on my slide to tell you, don't push it. This will dump all the pressure and somebody will have to pump it back up, but don't push it. APU Start Solenoid Valve. When I'm working in conjunction with my electronic sequencing unit box and my switch on the overhead control panel, when I'm starting my APU, this is what's going to release the pressure from the APU Start Module to my APU, or APU Start Accumulator to my APU motor pump. And then there's that pressure operated valve. Again, I've got 3,000 PSI of pressure stored in the APU Start Accumulator. I just don't want to throw it in front of that APU motor pump and say start spinning with 3,000 PSI. This allows it to start spooling up slowly. Now again, back to the gauge. If that gauge is not there, use your discretion. Technically, yeah, probably would be a red X. But there's pressure in there, I can guarantee you. If my APU Start Accumulator has 3,000 PSI, my utility reservoir pressurization accumulator has 3,000 PSI, my swivel lock accumulator has 3,000 PSI in it. If I go up there and I attempt to start my APU, and the APU starts, I'll guarantee you there was 3,000 PSI in that accumulator there too. APU don't start, then maybe that gauge was correct. The accumulator bled off. As long as the APU starts, then there was 3,000 PSI in there, because that is where it tells it when to be a motor and a pump. If it doesn't get the signal from this start module, then when you try to start the APU, then it's trying to pump hydraulic fluid and turn the APU at the same time. It's not going to happen. Just not enough pressure there for it to happen. Apu Control Box. We'll talk a lot about this during APU class, but I want to show some of the things because they've gotten into a habit lately of started asking questions about this. This box comes out of designed for 2 different aircraft, but they hook up differently. I can go out pre-flight and I can tell you which box this one was made for, whether it was made for a UH-60 or a CH-47. I can tell you now that this one was made for a UH-60. Just by finding that pigtail that's installed right there, that little there would be about 3 inches long black piece of plastic that allows their connector to hook up to our connector. If it was made for a CH-47 directly, that pigtail would not be there. So they may ask you a little trivia question that way. There are 4 byte indicators on there. When we go through the APU class, we will talk about how to detect what is wrong so that hopefully you can get it fixed and you can get home, or the flight engineer's not back there pumping it up 10 times trying to correct the problem. But they will have to watch it start and go through the sequence. Hopefully you get a better code than black, white, white, black, because that code there is just not good. Failure to start. If it started, I wouldn't be looking at it. Any questions about the APU Start module? When does APU become self-sustaining again? 90%. Starter motor located on top of the engine at the 12 o'clock position. Again, it's just another hydraulic pump / motor. And when you get to your engine class tomorrow, Tom will discuss that very good, I hope. How much pressure does it take to turn that motor? 3350. So if we have a failure of if we have an engine failure in flight, we attempt to restart it, we're going to have to crank our APU, because APU motor pump's the only one that gives us that pressure. Back on top of our pressure control module, when we hit our engine start buttons, whether I flip it to number 1 or number 2, I'm energizing the corresponding start solenoid valve on top of the pressure control module. All right, some of our emergency procedures. Flying along fat, dumb, and happy. Master cause panel illuminates. You get the utility hydraulic system light. What made that light come on? Anybody remember what that was called? It's a switch. It's my pressure switch, located on my pressure control module. That is the only indication for you as a pilot that anything has gone wrong in the cockpit with the utility system. That light will come on when pressure drops below what? 1800 psi. That light will go off 2300 psi. First thing out of my mouth whenever I saw this light would probably be chief check for fluid loss, but we'll see what it says. Because you're not going to know whether this is true or not unless you ask the chief, is fluid loss evident? If it is evident, land as soon as possible. Isolation switch off, affected subsystem. Again, there's nothing up there that's marked isolation switch. If it was the brakes, power steering, or swivel locks, I hit the brake steer switch. If it was my ramp, I can turn the ramp off. If it was a PTU, I could turn my PTUs off. You just got to think about which one it would be. If pressure is restored once I do the isolation switch, land as soon as practical, maintenance panel monitor. If fluid loss is not evident, APU start, land as soon as practical. Hopefully if fluid loss is not evident, you get that light. Hopefully all you did was you lose your utility pump, now you've restored the pressure. If temperatures or pressures are abnormal and vibrations occur, land as soon as possible. Trying to figure out how to word this. Just be aware with your dash 10 that we have some hidden emergencies. What if I did come over and tell you, sir, ma'am, utility hydraulic temperature is 95%. Or 95 degrees. What is your emergency procedure?
Yeah, 1 o'clock, the max is 1:20.
Okay. Well, we've reached 120. What is it? And as soon as possible. Is there such a thing as hot, or is it buried under another emergency procedure? Okay. I mean, just be aware that if that light does not come on, and if chief tells you in the back that it's hot, I don't have to wait for that light to come on to start that emergency procedure. That should be common sense. But we teach rogue memorization around this course, and we try to beat people in. If that light does not come on and the chief tells you that it's getting hot in the back, we're still going to land. If high fluid temperature is evident, land as soon as possible. Then here's our pump fault lights for all 4 of the pumps that we have in the system. Land as soon as practical, maintenance panel monitor. I want to go back to one button or one light. Any questions about the emergency procedure so far? Those things that you're just going to have to keep practicing. I want to ask about this light because it's asked on the flight line sometimes. And I want to explain how the system works. Has everybody flown yet? Just once. So everybody's been in the cockpit and you crank the APU. When I turn the battery switch on, is this one of the lights that's on or off before I start my APU? It's on. Okay. It's on when I turn the battery switch on. How many times will that light go off during APU start? I agree with him. Everybody hear what he said? Twice. Okay. I want to explain this just so you can get a sense of how the system works. This light is on because of what? No pressure, correct? Okay. The pressure right now is sitting at the Apu Start Accumulator. When I go up there on my APU switch and I turn it to run and then start, I release 3,000 PSI of pressure from my APU Start Accumulator. Where is the first place that 3,000 PSI of pressure is going to go? Before it goes to the APU motor pump, it's got to go here. From here it goes to the APU motor pump. But when it goes through here, it's got to hit that pressure switch. That pressure switch says, okay, I've just got 3,000 PSI of pressure, light go out. But during the start sequence of my APU, the pressure that's in that APU Start Accumulator is going to drop below 1,800 PSI. When it drops below 1,800 PSI, that light's going to come back on temporarily. As soon as the APU becomes self-sustaining at 90% speed, first thing it does is go back and recharges that accumulator, and it sends pressure now to my pressure control module saying, okay, I'm above 1,800 PSI, light go back out. So be aware of it. When you start your APU, that light's going to go out twice, and that's why. When I first turn the battery switch on, I haven't released any pressure anywhere yet. As soon as I turn my APU switch to the run, it's going to release that 3,000 PSI from the APU Start Accumulator through the pressure control module, through my APU Start module to my APU motor pump. Pressure is going to deplete down below 1,800 PSI, light's going to come on, APU is going to get started, and rebuild my pressure, and light go back out. Now when your IP asks you that, you can explain that now, correct? Maybe. Now, are there any questions about the system? When we start out our flight control hydraulics class Thursday, the first two components I'm going to break out are going to be this one, pressure control module, and then our return control module. And I will ask what those components are on top of them. So I'll give you a little bit of advance notice, study those a little bit because those are important. They're going to ask you, you can see those, and you do need to know which switches affect what systems so that you can isolate the systems during a leak.